Hello and welcome to Armed with Speculation, the channel where we talk about all things Command & Conquer and eventually other RTSs too. Today we are going to be talking about flak weapons and why they might work in a 70s world. And wow, did I ever give myself a doozy of a topic. This one is going to kick my butt, is what I thought before I really got started doing research. Going to be interesting. Okay, here we go. Their earliest uses of anti-aircraft guns refer back to the U.S. Army during the American Civil War, where the main U.S. Army fielded balloons, which compelled Confederates to develop methods of combating them. This included uses of artillery, small arms, and saboteurs. They were largely unsuccessful, but this idea put in the sorts of strategies that we might see later in war into the minds of the innovators of the time period. Working our way into the First World War, most of these guns involved machine guns or cannons, simply with their noses pointed upwards. These sorts of defenses didn't work particularly well initially, and the first major issue that they had to overcome was ammunition. Before World War I, it was recognized that ammunition needed to explode in the air. Both high explosives and shrapnel were used, mostly the former. Airburst fuses were either igniferous, based on a burning fuse, or mechanical, like clockwork. Igniferous fuses were not well suited for anti-aircraft use. Fuse length was determined by time of flight, but the burning rate of the gunpowder was affected by altitude. The British used pom-poms had contact fuses primarily. Zeppelins, being hydrogen-filled balloons, were targets for incendiary shells. The British introduced these with airburst fuses, both shrapnel type, forward projection of incendiary pot, and base injection of an incendiary stream. These British also fitted tracers to their shells to use at night. Smoke shells were also available for some AA guns. These bursts were used as targets during training. This is the beginning of what we might see as the modern flak gun, as we might know it from World War II and closely afterwards. The main thing was, as we started transitioning from balloons into modern aircraft, the speed of which fights would happen changed drastically. You had to lead your targets with much more precision. British dealt with the range measurements first, using a height rangefinder to more accurately decide the height of the object that they were firing against. Many other improvements were forthcoming, and into the interwar years, most of the world had decided that aircraft could be an important part of the battlefield, but for most people in that era, strategic air attack was the main issue, presenting a threat and an opportunity. In this period, the idea of focusing on larger airplanes, larger bombers, rather than the fast-moving fighters, which were much more difficult to hit with airburst fuses, proliferated, leading to a blanket of fire sort of thing, where at a certain altitude, you would have these cannons blazing away, covering, let's say, 10,000 feet, with a masterful blanket of explosions that would shred through aircraft with frightening ease. This, coupled with a much higher rate of fire and better height finding by longer range optical instruments, and centralized control of fire of each gun position by commanders in a region, allowed for effective counter bombing fire. In this period, most of these guns fired very, very large shells, very high and very fast. And the reason for this is because it was very difficult to hit something very small and very nippy with really accurate rounds. You had to have an area of effect explosion in order to get the most bang for your buck in this period without computers. But there you go then. We're in the 70s, at least in Red Alert 2. So we be entering the area where the Harrier, supersonic flight, much harder to hit with conventional large-scale artillery, anti-air artillery, and unfortunately that is what the Soviets in the game use, very large anti-air artillery pieces. So how do we square this circle? How do we make it so these sorts of tactics could still be used in a world consumed by jet fighters? As indeed in the game, mostly what they're dealing with are jet fighters, jet attack craft. They're not dealing with bombers. So we're talking about high altitude, incredibly fast, very specialized fighters. How do we square the circle? And the answer came from some research into how modern anti-aircraft systems work. Starting with the CWIS system, the phalanx of popular naval anti-air fame. I had known about it for years because it's freaking amazing, but I had never really looked at the implications of still using it. I mean, we have missile systems now. Why would we ever use a large gun which throws bullets to take down airplanes traveling at hundreds of miles an hour? Missiles are just so much more accurate. How could we possibly justify this? And it turns out that I was underestimating our development of computer systems. Most of the computers that were on systems on jets back in that period would be dwarfed by the capability of my computer right now, or even my phone. But it was still very complex for the time and was quite capable of taking down jet fighters and other craft. Take, for example, the Gepard in this picture in motion at the 2015 Military Day in Ulfheim. The Gepard is an autonomous, all-weather capable German self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, which as a layman just showed me that this stuff could be still applicable. But the next question there was, why are these cannons so much smaller than you might see in a World War II anti-aircraft gun? And that comes from the difference in strategy here. For instance, the large AA guns were made to hit a large area of effect and deal with large groups of formation-led bombers. And the reason for that was because of the lack of accuracy. You had a meatbag pilot instead of a computer guiding the weapon. With the introduction of many computers into the mix, you now had incredibly accurate designs that didn't need to have the massive guns in their wide area of effect because they could reliably hit nearly any aircraft through computer tracking and radar. This sort of flak was used as a main aircraft killer in the Vietnam War. It was also widely used in Iraq in the 1992 Gulf War. Effectively, 50 smaller rounds could do the job of thousands of larger rounds, and thus it was not very cost efficient to use these very large cannons. So why do the Soviets in Red Alert 2 use these very large guns? That is the question of the video. And the answer came from another video that I've done fairly recently about the terror drone. This version of the Soviet military is much more advanced with computers, even more advanced than computers than the Western world is, and is very capable of producing extremely complicated targeting designs, as we see from the terror drone, that is almost self-aware in its ability to pick out targets that are Russian and not Russian. Equipped with one of these large cannons could do exactly what they're supposed to do. They could be incredibly accurate, hitting very high-flying aircraft with extremely large shells that are likely to bring down the target in a single hit or several. which is more cost effective even than dozens and dozens and dozens of smaller rounds. There may also be more improvements, such as the rounds may have indeed a ability to detect magnetic fields of aircraft around them, so that they have a sort of short-range contact fuse that explodes when they get close to the aircraft itself, eliminating the fact that if you were to just use a jet in some World War II flak areas, you could avoid them by simply flying lower or higher than the standard 10,000 feet fuse height. The genius of this sort of system is that it allows the Soviet Union to be incredibly cost efficient. It allows it to continue using many guns that it would have used in the World War and in periods up till that point, and simply upgrade them and continue producing what we might deceive ourselves into thinking is too primitive a technology to be used on a modern battlefield. This is a similar reason why the ones in Red Alert 3 would work exactly the same, although they have smaller guns. They're not using quite the very large guns that the Soviets are using in Red Alert 2. I'm assuming, for the sake of having these weapons be effective, that they are very well guided, computer guided rounds launched from a Soviet supervised position. Brutally effective weapons, no doubt. And if they continue iterating on this technology, we shall see how they fare against the Skrin after the 1995 Tiberium hits, and we get to see what the Soviet Union and the United States do in a war against Nod and Skrin coming up later, should that ever happen in the hypothetical next game. Anyway, I thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Sorry this video took so long to get out. This has been Karakin from Armed with Speculation, signing off.